History books tell you about the gold rushes and cattle drives, about outlaws and lawmen who tamed the West. But they whisper nothing of the darkest corners of frontier justice, where money and power made their own laws. In Thornridge, Colorado, 1878, something unthinkable happened in plain sight. A young woman sold like property to settle her father's debts. A marriage forced upon her to a man the town despised for the color of his skin. A punishment designed to humiliate them both. They thought they were sentencing me to a fate worse than death. They were wrong about everything. What happened that night wasn't just shocking, it was revolutionary, a single act that forced an entire town to its knees in shame. A truth so powerful they tried to bury it forever. Sometimes justice wears no badge, and dignity can't be bought or sold. If you've never heard this story, there's a reason. Some truths are too dangerous to the powerful. But today, we're breaking the silence. Stay with me until the end to discover what this black rancher did that changed the West forever, and why some still want this story buried. If this is your first time here, I'm sharing untold stories from America's forgotten history on the Black Rancher channel. Hit subscribe now and ring that bell so you never miss these powerful tales of courage that history tried to erase. What you're about to hear isn't just a story, it's a reckoning with our past. Share this video because these truths deserve to be known. Now let's begin our journey to Thornridge, Colorado, 1878. The summer heat bore down mercilessly on Thornridge's town square as Eleanor Walsh stood on the auction block, her legs trembling beneath her modest blue dress. At 20 years old, with auburn hair pulled tightly into a practical bun and green eyes downcast, she fought to maintain composure as Mayor Hargrove read the announcement. By order of the Territorial Court, Miss Eleanor Walsh is hereby transferred in matrimony to settle the outstanding debts of Thomas Walsh, amounting to $1,200 in mining investments and loans. Eleanor's father stood nearby, his once proud shoulders now slumped in disgrace, unwilling to meet his daughter's gaze. Just 3 months ago, they'd been respected members of the community. Now, after the mine collapse destroyed not just his investment, but his reputation, he'd been given an ultimatum by the town's elite: sacrifice his daughter or face imprisonment. Judge Whitaker, his round face flushed from heat and whiskey, addressed the crowd gathered in the dusty square. The court recognizes the unorthodox nature of this proceeding, but frontier justice requires creative solutions. Miss Walsh will be sold in matrimony to the highest bidder, with all proceeds going to her father's creditors. Whispers rippled through the onlookers. Most were working folks, miners, shopkeepers, and ranchers who'd come to town for supplies. Some looked uncomfortable, shifting their weight and avoiding Eleanor's eyes. Others watched with undisguised curiosity or barely concealed hunger. The bidding started low. $20, called a grizzled miner, missing 3 fingers and most of his teeth. Eleanor flinched but remained silent. Her father had made it clear. This was her duty. Her sacrifice would save the family name, such as it remained. 50, countered Stanley Cooper, the undertaker whose wife had died 2 winters ago. He was 30 years Eleanor's senior, with cold hands and calculating eyes. 75, shouted another voice, belonging to a cattle driver passing through. The man spat tobacco juice into the dirt and grinned, revealing stained teeth. Tears threatened to spill down Eleanor's cheeks, but she blinked them back furiously. She would not give them the satisfaction. In her pocket, she clutched the small knife her mother had given her before consumption took her 3 years prior. "Never let them take your dignity," her mother had whispered. Eleanor had other plans for tonight, regardless of who won her. The bids continued, climbing slowly past $100. Eleanor's value to these men was clear: a young woman to cook, clean, warm their beds, and bear their children. Her thoughts, dreams, and desires meant nothing. Then, from the back of the crowd, a deep voice cut through the commotion. $600. The crowd fell silent, parting to reveal a tall black man in a dark brown Stetson. Marcus Freeman stood straight-backed and serious, his expression unreadable. At 35, his face bore the weathered lines of a man who'd fought for everything he had. His clothes were of good quality but practical, the attire of a working rancher rather than a town dandy. Judge Whitaker's face contorted with disgust. "Freeman, this isn't a proceeding for your kind." Marcus didn't flinch. "My money spends the same as any man's. $600 cash." He held up a leather pouch that clinked with the unmistakable sound of gold coins. Eleanor's eyes widened. She'd seen Marcus Freeman in town occasionally, always keeping to himself. Everyone knew he owned the Crescent Moon Ranch 5 miles outside of town, 400 acres of prime grazing land that had once belonged to the judge's brother until a drought and bad investments forced its sale. The judge had never forgiven Freeman for purchasing that land. "This is an outrage," sputtered Hargrove. "We can't allow—" "700, countered Stanley Cooper, his thin lips pressed into a tight line. "800, Freeman replied calmly. A tense silence fell over the crowd. $800 was a small fortune in these parts, more than many men earned in a year. Cooper looked at his empty wallet and shook his head, defeated. Judge Whitaker looked around desperately. "Any other bids?" When no one spoke, his face flushed darker. "Perhaps we should adjourn and continue." "The law is clear," Freeman interrupted. "Highest bidder wins." "Unless you're saying the court's word means nothing," several townsfolk murmured in agreement. Despite their prejudices, most respected the sanctity of a financial transaction. Business was business. With visible reluctance, Judge Whitaker raised his gavel. $800 going once and twice. $1,000, came a new voice. Harold Blackwood, owner of the Silver Strike Saloon and the richest man in the county, stepped forward. His expensive suit and gold watch chain marked him as a man of means. At 45, his once handsome features had hardened into something predatory. And 200 more for the town treasury. A bribe, plain and simple. Eleanor felt bile rise in her throat. Blackwood's reputation with women was well known, particularly the young dance hall girls who rarely lasted more than a few months at his establishment. Marcus Freeman's jaw tightened, but his voice remained steady. 1,200. Blackwood's eyes narrowed. 13. 1,500, Freeman countered. The crowd gasped. Such a sum was unheard of, especially from a black rancher whom many had assumed was merely getting by. Blackwood hesitated, then smiled thinly. "The colored man can have her. Damaged goods anyway with that family history." He turned away, but not before saying loudly, "Consider it poetic justice. Her father never would share a water trough with your kind, Freeman. Now you'll share a bed with his daughter." Cruel laughter rippled through some of the onlookers. Eleanor's face burned with shame and rage. Her father stared at the ground, shoulders shaking silently. Judge Whitaker looked as if he'd bitten into something rotten, but the substantial bid had tied his hands. Sold to Marcus Freeman for $1,500. He banged his gavel with unnecessary force. Marriage to be performed immediately to complete the transaction. 20 minutes later, Eleanor stood woodenly beside Marcus Freeman in the town's small church as a reluctant Pastor Williams rushed through the ceremony, skipping the customary prayers and blessings. No family stood beside her. No flowers adorned the empty pews. The only witnesses were the judge, the mayor, and her father, all legally required to ensure the transaction was complete. "I now pronounce you man and wife," the pastor mumbled, avoiding eye contact with either of them. There was no invitation to kiss the bride. As they emerged from the church, Eleanor clutching a hastily signed marriage certificate, jeers and catcalls followed them down the street. "Enjoy your night, Freeman. Hope she's worth all that gold. Show her who's master now." Eleanor kept her eyes fixed on the dusty road as Marcus led her to a well-maintained wagon hitched to 2 strong bay horses. He helped her up without touching more than her elbow, then climbed up beside her. As he took the reins, he spoke his first words directly to her, pitched low so only she could hear. "Miss Eleanor, I know you're planning something with whatever you've got hidden in your pocket. I'm asking you to wait just one night. After that, if you still want to use it, I won't stop you." Eleanor's blood turned cold. How had he known about the knife? She said nothing, staring straight ahead as he clicked to the horses, and they began the journey out of town, toward the Crescent Moon Ranch and whatever fate awaited her. The 5-mile journey to the Crescent Moon Ranch passed in tense silence. Eleanor sat rigidly beside Marcus, her hands clutching her small travel bag, the only possession she'd been allowed to take. Inside were 2 dresses, a hairbrush, her mother's tarnished silver hand mirror, and a worn Bible. The knife remained hidden in her pocket, its presence both a comfort and a burden. As they crested a small hill, the ranch came into view. Eleanor's eyes widened despite herself. The Crescent Moon was not the modest homestead she'd expected, but a well-established property. A 2-story farmhouse painted white with green trim stood proudly amid several outbuildings. A large barn, freshly painted red, dominated the yard. Neat fences enclosed corrals containing fine horses. Beyond them stretched pastures where cattle grazed contentedly. A creek wound through the property, its banks lined with cottonwood trees offering welcome shade. Marcus noticed her surprise. Been here 12 years now. Bought it when it was barely more than a broken-down cabin and 30 acres of overgrazed land. How did you afford it? Eleanor asked before she could stop herself. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. I was a blacksmith in the Union Army during the war, saved every penny. After I worked the railroad, then as a trail cook for cattle drives. Lived on nothing, saved everything. He paused. Freedom doesn't mean much without land to stand on. As they approached the house, Eleanor noticed the carefully tended garden with vegetables growing in tidy rows and flower beds bordering the front porch. This was not the home of a man who lived alone. Her question was answered when the front door opened and an elderly black woman emerged, wiping her hands on her apron. Her silver hair was neatly braided, and despite her advanced age, she stood straight and dignified. "You're late, Marcus. I was starting to worry." Her eyes found Eleanor, registering first curiosity, then something like understanding, and finally determination. "So this is what took you to town today?" Marcus helped Eleanor down from the wagon. "Miss Eleanor Walsh, Freeman now, I suppose. My aunt, Hattie Freeman." Hattie nodded, her expression softening slightly. "Come in, child. You look like you could use a cup of tea and some quiet." Eleanor followed hesitantly, steeling herself against whatever might await inside. To her surprise, the house's interior was spotlessly clean and comfortably furnished. The front room held a stone fireplace, a sofa covered in faded but clean fabric, 2 rocking chairs, and bookshelves lined with more volumes than she'd ever seen outside the town's small library. "You read?" she asked, unable to hide her surprise. "My aunt was a teacher back in Virginia before the war," Marcus replied, hanging his hat on a hook by the door. "She taught me my letters when I was 4. Never stopped since." Hattie led Eleanor to the kitchen, a warm space dominated by a large cast-iron stove and a sturdy wooden table. The savory smell of stew simmered on the back burner, and fresh baked bread cooled on the counter. "Sit, child," Hattie instructed, pouring tea into 3 cups. "I imagine this has been the worst day of your life." The simple acknowledgement of her ordeal, without judgment or pity, broke something in Eleanor. Tears she'd held back all day spilled down her cheeks. Hattie placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "Let it come. Tears can wash away more than just sadness." Marcus remained standing, awkward in his own kitchen. "I'll see to the horses," he mumbled, retreating to the yard. When he'd gone, Hattie sat across from Eleanor. "I won't insult you by asking if you came here willingly," she said. "I heard rumors in town about the auction. Barbaric business." Her eyes flashed with old anger. "I've seen my share of people being sold. Never thought I'd live to see it happening to white folks too." Eleanor wiped her tears with a handkerchief Hattie offered. "What happens now?" she whispered. "That depends partly on you," Hattie replied. "But let me tell you about my nephew. Marcus fought for his freedom, then worked himself near to death for this land. He's a proud man, but a good one. He's never raised his hand in anger, not even to an animal, and he's never forced himself on anyone." Eleanor stiffened at the implication. "Then why did he buy me?" Hattie's eyes held hers steadily. "That's for him to explain, but I know it wasn't for the reasons those townfolk were jeering about." She rose. "Come, let me show you where you'll sleep." To Eleanor's surprise, Hattie led her upstairs to a pleasant bedroom with a single bed, a washstand, a small dresser, and a window overlooking the creek. Clean towels and a pitcher of fresh water waited on the washstand. "This is your room," Hattie said. "Marcus sleeps across the hall. I'm downstairs by the kitchen." She pointed to a key in the door. "It locks from the inside." Eleanor stared at the key, then at Hattie, confusion evident on her face. "Marriage certificate or not, you didn't choose this," Hattie said simply. "In this house, we believe choice matters." After Hattie left, Eleanor sank onto the bed, her emotions too tangled to name. The knife in her pocket now seemed like a hasty mistake. She removed it and slid it under her pillow, unsure if she still needed it but unwilling to surrender her only means of control. She washed her face and hands, changed into her nightgown, and after a moment's hesitation, turned the key in the lock. Then she sat by the window, watching the sun set over the distant mountains, wondering what game these people were playing and what would happen when night gave way to morning. Downstairs, she could hear low voices, Marcus and Hattie in conversation. Though she couldn't make out the words, there was no shouting, no anger. Occasionally, she caught the deeper rumble of Marcus's laugh. As darkness fell completely, a soft knock came at her door. "Miss Eleanor." It was Marcus. "There's supper ready when you want it, no rush," and he paused. "I know you probably don't believe me, but you're safe here." His footsteps retreated down the hall. Eleanor remained by the window for a long time, watching the stars emerge in the clear Colorado sky, trying to reconcile the man who had spent a fortune to buy her with the one who had given her a room with a lock. Eventually, hunger drove her downstairs. The kitchen was empty save for a covered plate on the table and a note in a careful hand. "Eat when ready. We've turned in for the night." They had given her space, dignity, the choice of whether to join them or not. As she ate the simple but delicious stew, Eleanor realized she had expected many things today: humiliation, violation, perhaps even death by her own hand. What she hadn't expected was consideration, respect. She had until morning to decide what that meant. Dawn broke over the Crescent Moon Ranch, painting the sky in hues of gold and pink. Eleanor woke to the unfamiliar sounds of a working farm, roosters crowing, cattle lowing in the distance, the soft whinnying of horses in the corral. For a moment she was disoriented. Then yesterday's events crashed back upon her. She was Mrs. Freeman now, at least on paper. She dressed quickly in one of her 2 remaining dresses and made her way downstairs, where she found Hattie already preparing breakfast. The older woman looked up with a smile. "Good morning. Sleep well?" "Better than I expected," Eleanor admitted. In truth, exhaustion had eventually overcome her anxiety, giving her a few hours of dreamless sleep. "Good. Marcus has been up since before dawn. Man never learned to sleep past 5, even on Sundays." Hattie handed her a cup of coffee. "There's eggs and bacon coming. Would you mind setting the table?" The simple request, treating her like a family member rather than a possession, caught Eleanor off guard. She nodded and began arranging plates and utensils on the kitchen table. Marcus entered from outside, his shirt already showing signs of the morning's work. He stopped short at the sight of Eleanor, as if surprised to see her there. "Morning," he said awkwardly, removing his hat. "Wash up," Hattie instructed him. "Breakfast is nearly ready." The 3 ate in a silence that was not entirely uncomfortable. Eleanor noticed that Marcus ate quickly but neatly, a working man accustomed to returning to his tasks promptly. When he'd finished, he pushed back from the table. "Miss Eleanor, when you're ready, I'd like to speak with you. I'll be in the barn." After helping Hattie with the dishes, again treated as a participant rather than a servant, Eleanor made her way to the barn. She found Marcus brushing down a beautiful chestnut mare, his movements gentle and methodical. "She's lovely," Eleanor said, keeping her distance. Marcus nodded. "Athena, best cutting horse in the county, though folks won't admit it on account of who owns her." He finished brushing and set the brush aside, turning to face Eleanor fully. "I owe you an explanation about yesterday." Eleanor crossed her arms protectively. "Yes, you do." Marcus gestured to a bench along the wall, and they both sat, maintaining a respectful distance between them. "First, I want you to know that I don't consider you my wife, regardless of what that paper says. A real marriage needs consent from both parties. Eleanor studied him suspiciously. Then why pay such a sum for me? Marcus looked down at his hands, strong and calloused from years of ranch work. Because what they were doing was wrong, and I couldn't stand by and watch. He met her eyes. And because I know what it's like to be property. His words hung in the air between them. Eleanor had never considered this perspective. My aunt and I were born slaves in Virginia, Marcus continued. Our master's son taught her to read in secret, and she taught me. When the war came, I escaped and joined the Union Army. After emancipation, I brought Aunt Hattie west with me. We've been free 12 years now, but I'll never forget what it was like to be bought and sold. He paused, letting his words sink in. When I heard about the auction, I couldn't believe it was happening in 1878. In a territory that fought for the Union, I went to town intending to protest. But when I saw you standing there, you pitied me, Eleanor said flatly. No, Marcus replied firmly. I respected you. You stood there with your chin up, refusing to break even as they stripped away your humanity. I recognized that strength. He sighed. I had the money. I've been saving to expand the ranch, but this seemed more important. I couldn't stop the auction, the town's too set in its ways, but I could keep you from Blackwood or Cooper or any of those others. Eleanor's defenses began to crack. What do you want from me in return? Nothing you don't freely choose to give, Marcus said simply. You can stay here as long as you need, help with the ranch if you want, until you decide what comes next. If that's leaving, I won't stop you. I'll even provide you with funds to start somewhere new. Eleanor blinked, stunned by the offer. You'd spend $1,500 just to let me go. Marcus shrugged. Freedom isn't freedom if it comes with conditions. Before Eleanor could respond, they heard the sound of approaching horses. Marcus stood instantly alert. We don't get many visitors out here. They walked out of the barn to see 3 riders approaching, Judge Whitaker, Mayor Hargrove, and Harold Blackwood. All 3 men looked grim. Stay behind me, Marcus murmured to Eleanor. Something's not right. The 3 men halted their horses in the yard. Blackwood's expensive stallion pawed at the ground impatiently, mirroring its owner's restless energy. Freeman, the judge acknowledged coldly. We've come on official business. Marcus's expression remained neutral. What business would that be, Judge? Hargrove pulled a document from his coat. There's been a complaint about the legitimacy of yesterday's transaction. Mr. Blackwood has raised concerns that you may have come by your funds dishonestly. Eleanor felt a chill run through her. This was a pretext, nothing more. My money was earned honestly through years of hard work, Marcus replied. As the judge well knows, having seen my tax payments each year. Blackwood smirked. Perhaps. But there's also the matter of this marriage. Many in town find it objectionable. Against natural law, some might say. There's no law against it in Colorado territory, Marcus countered. Otherwise, you wouldn't have allowed the auction to proceed. The judge shifted uncomfortably in his saddle. Nevertheless, we're here to investigate these concerns and to ensure Miss Walsh's well-being. Eleanor stepped forward, her voice steady despite her racing heart. Mrs. Freeman, she corrected, and I'm perfectly well, thank you. The 3 men exchanged glances. This wasn't going as they'd planned. Young lady, Hargrove began in a patronizing tone, you've been through a traumatic experience. Perhaps you're not thinking clearly. Mr. Blackwood has generously offered to nullify your father's remaining debts if you were to come back to town with us today. Eleanor understood immediately. They had never intended to let this marriage stand. Once she was back in town, they would find a way to annul it, and she would be at their mercy again. I appreciate your concern, she replied with forced politeness, but I'm staying here with my husband. The word felt strange on her lips, but the look of displeasure on Blackwood's face made it worthwhile. I insist we speak privately, Blackwood said, dismounting and taking a step toward Eleanor. Marcus moved between them. The lady has given you her answer. Tension crackled in the air. Eleanor noticed Marcus's hand hadn't moved toward the gun belt hanging by the barn door. He was refusing to escalate, despite the implied threat of 3 powerful men on his property. The standoff was interrupted by the appearance of Hattie, carrying a shotgun with casual confidence. "Gentlemen," she called, "coffee's hot if you've come to be social. If not, I believe my nephew and his wife have made their position clear." Blackwood's face darkened with anger, but the judge put a restraining hand on his arm. "Another time, perhaps," he said tightly. "But this matter isn't settled, Freeman. The town council will be discussing it further." As the 3 men rode away, Eleanor felt her legs begin to tremble. The confrontation had taken more courage than she'd realized. Marcus turned to her, respect evident in his eyes. "You didn't have to do that." "Yes, I did," Eleanor replied. "They came here expecting to find me broken or mistreated, something that would justify their interference. I couldn't let them use me against you, not after what you did." Marcus studied her face. "And what was it that I did exactly? You saw me as a person when everyone else saw property." Her voice softened. "Thank you for that." Before Marcus could respond, Hattie called from the porch. "Those vultures will be back. We need to be ready." As they walked back to the house together, Eleanor felt something shift inside her. For the first time since her father's financial ruin, she had made a choice of her own. She had claimed her voice. And even if this arrangement was temporary, even if she eventually took Marcus up on his offer to leave, she would do so on her terms, not theirs. You're watching The Black Rancher, where we uncover the hidden stories of courage that shaped America. If you're captivated by Eleanor and Marcus's story so far, hit that subscribe button and notification bell right now. Remember to share this video with someone who appreciates powerful stories of dignity and resistance. Now let's return to Thornridge, Colorado, as the town's powerful men plot their next move against the unlikely couple at Crescent Moon Ranch. 3 days passed relatively peacefully at the Crescent Moon Ranch. Eleanor quickly fell into the rhythm of ranch life, helping Hattie with household tasks and learning about the operation from Marcus. She discovered that the ranch employed 4 workers, 2 Mexican vaqueros named Miguel and Javier, and 2 former slaves, brothers Samuel and Isaiah, who had followed Marcus west after the war. All 4 men lived in small but comfortable cabins on the property and treated Eleanor with cautious respect. On the 4th morning, Eleanor was gathering eggs in the chicken coop when she heard the sound of an approaching wagon. Peering through the window, she saw her father's weathered farm wagon coming up the drive, her father himself at the reins. She hurried out to meet him, a complex mixture of emotions churning inside her. Thomas Walsh looked 10 years older than he had at the auction, his face haggard, his clothes rumpled as if he'd slept in them. "Father," she greeted him coolly as he climbed down from the wagon. "Eleanor," he replied, removing his hat and twisting it nervously in his hands. You look well." "I am well," she answered, maintaining her distance. "What brings you here?" He glanced around anxiously. Is he here?" "My husband is checking the north pasture with his men. Aunt Hattie is inside." Eleanor deliberately used the family term for the older woman, watching her father flinch. "I need to speak with you, privately." Eleanor hesitated, then nodded toward a bench under a large cottonwood tree. "We can talk there." Once seated, Thomas Walsh seemed at a loss for words. Finally, he blurted, "You can come home now, it's been arranged." Eleanor stiffened. "What's been arranged?" "Blackwood and the judge. They've found a legal loophole. The marriage can be annulled on grounds that it was conducted under duress." He reached for her hand, which she pulled away. "You don't have to stay here with him." "And if I want to stay?" Eleanor asked quietly. Her father looked genuinely bewildered. "Why would you want that? Eleanor, be reasonable. He's a good man who treated me with more respect in 4 days than the town's so-called gentlemen have in my entire life," she finished firmly. Thomas Walsh's face reddened. "You don't know what you're saying. They've turned you against your own kind." "My kind sold me to pay your debts," Eleanor replied, her voice sharp with suppressed anger. "My kind stood by and watched it happen without protest." "I had no choice," her father protested. "They would have sent me to territorial prison." And I had no choice either, Eleanor countered. Yet you expect me to forgive you while condemning Marcus for actually helping me. Her father's expression hardened. So it's Marcus now, is it? Has he already gotten you into his bed? Is that why you're defending him? The crude accusation struck Eleanor like a physical blow. He hasn't touched me, she said through clenched teeth. He gave me my own room with a lock on the door. He treats me like a human being with choices, not property to be used. Thomas Walsh looked unconvinced. The town won't stand for this, Eleanor. They're already talking, saying terrible things about you, about what's happening out here. Let them talk, Eleanor replied, though his words stung. I know the truth. Her father leaned closer, lowering his voice. There's more you don't know. Blackwood and some others, they're planning something. I don't know what exactly, but they're not going to let this stand. A colored man married to a white woman, owning one of the best ranches in the county. They see it as a threat. A chill ran through Eleanor. Are you warning me or threatening me? Warning you. Her father looked hurt. Despite everything, you're still my daughter. I don't want to see you hurt when this all goes bad. And it will go bad, Eleanor. Men like Freeman don't win against men like Blackwood. Eleanor studied her father's face, seeing genuine concern beneath his prejudice and self-interest. Thank you for the warning, she said more gently, but I've made my choice. Thomas Walsh rose heavily. Then there's nothing more to say, except, he hesitated, your mother would be proud of your courage if not your judgment. The mention of her mother brought unexpected tears to Eleanor's eyes. She blinked them back, unwilling to show weakness now. As her father climbed back into his wagon, he paused. One last thing. Blackwood paid off my remaining debts yesterday, said he was doing it as a gesture of goodwill toward the family. I don't trust his motives. Neither do I, Eleanor agreed. Be careful, father. She watched him drive away, a solitary figure hunched over the reins, diminished somehow from the man who had raised her. For all his faults, he had come to warn her. It was something. When Marcus returned from the pasture, Eleanor told him about her father's visit and warning. Marcus listened gravely. I've been expecting something like this. Blackwood isn't a man who accepts defeat gracefully. What will we do? Eleanor asked. Marcus raised an eyebrow at the "we," but didn't comment on it. Be prepared. I've asked the men to take turns keeping watch at night. Samuel and Isaiah have moved their things to the bunkhouse behind the barn to be closer. This is because of me, Eleanor said, guilt washing over her. I've brought this trouble to your door. Marcus shook his head. This was brewing long before you arrived. Blackwood's been trying to get this land for years. He knows there's a silver vein running through the north end of the property. I refuse to sell. So I'm just a convenient excuse, Eleanor realized aloud. You're more than that, Marcus said quietly. You're the symbol they needed, proof that I've stepped beyond what they consider my proper place. That evening after supper, as Hattie taught Eleanor to make preserves from the summer berries, they heard the sound of multiple horses approaching. Marcus, who had been cleaning his rifle at the kitchen table, set it aside calmly. Stay inside, he instructed, his voice betraying no fear. Hattie knows what to do if there's trouble. Eleanor watched from the window as Marcus stepped onto the porch, silhouetted against the fading daylight. In the yard, at least 15 mounted men circled, their faces obscured by the gathering dusk and pulled down hat brims. Some held torches that cast an eerie flickering light over the scene. Freeman, called a voice Eleanor recognized as Blackwood's. We've come to correct a mistake. No mistake here, Marcus replied calmly. Just a man on his own property with his family. That's the mistake, another voice jeered. You were the white woman playing at being a real man. Eleanor's hands clenched into fists. Behind her, Hattie moved silently to retrieve the shotgun from its place by the door. I'd appreciate it if you gentlemen would leave my property, Marcus continued, his voice steady. It's been a long day and we're preparing for bed. A cruel laugh rippled through the crowd. Hear that, boys? He's eager to get to bed with his new bride. Blackwood urged his horse forward. We're giving you one chance, Freeman. Send the Walsh girl out, and we'll take her back to town where she belongs. Do that, and maybe we'll let you keep this ranch. Refuse, and we'll burn it to the ground with you in it. Eleanor's blood ran cold. Without thinking, she moved toward the door, but Hattie's iron grip on her arm stopped her. "Don't," the older woman whispered fiercely. "That's exactly what they want." Outside, Marcus hadn't moved an inch. "Miss Eleanor is here of her own free will. She's made that clear to her father and to Judge Whitaker. If you have legal concerns, take them up with the territorial court in Denver." "We handle our own justice here," Blackwood replied. "This isn't justice," Marcus replied, his voice carrying clearly through the evening air. "This is a lynch mob hiding behind fine words." A tense silence followed his statement. Even the horses seemed to sense the dangerous energy, shifting restlessly beneath their riders. Suddenly, from the shadows of the barn, Samuel and Isaiah emerged, each carrying a rifle. From the bunkhouse behind, Miguel and Javier appeared similarly armed. The four men moved to stand beside Marcus on the porch, creating a unified front. "You're outnumbered, Freeman," Blackwood warned, though Eleanor noticed a flicker of uncertainty in his posture. "Maybe," Marcus agreed. "But some of your men will die tonight if you push this. Are you willing to explain those deaths to their wives and children tomorrow, all to settle your wounded pride?" The mounted men exchanged uneasy glances. Bravery fueled by whiskey and hatred was one thing, facing determined men protecting their home was another. Eleanor could remain silent no longer. Despite Hattie's warning, she stepped onto the porch, positioning herself beside Marcus. "If you've come for me," she said clearly, "you should know I'm staying by choice. My husband has treated me with nothing but respect, which is more than I can say for the men of Thornridge who stood by watching while I was sold like cattle." A murmur ran through the crowd. Many of these men had indeed been present at the auction, their curiosity overriding any moral objections they might have had. "She's been corrupted," someone shouted, but the conviction was waning. "No," Eleanor countered. "For the first time in my life, I'm thinking clearly. You don't care about my welfare. This is about control, your need to decide who owns what and who belongs where. Marcus Freeman earned everything he has through honest work, while some of you," her eyes fixed pointedly on Blackwood, "build your fortunes on exploitation and suffering." Blackwood's face twisted with rage. "You'll regret those words, girl." "The only thing I regret," Eleanor replied steadily, "is that it took me so long to recognize men like you for what you really are." The standoff continued for several tense moments. Then, from the back of the crowd, a rider turned his horse and began to leave. Another followed, then another. "Where are you going?" Blackwood demanded. "We came to do a job." "I came to rescue a woman in danger," one man called back. "Don't look like she needs rescuing to me." "My Martha would have my hide if she knew I was threatening to burn a woman out of her home," added another, spurring his horse away. Soon, only Blackwood and four of his most loyal followers remained. The odds had shifted dramatically. "This isn't over, Freeman," Blackwood snarled, "not by a long shot." "Yes, it is," came a new voice. Sheriff Taylor rode into the yard, accompanied by two deputies. "Harold, I thought I made myself clear in town. No vigilante nonsense in my county." Eleanor had never been so relieved to see the aging lawman. Though not particularly progressive in his views, Sheriff Taylor was known for his commitment to maintaining order. "We were just leaving," Blackwood said tersely, wheeling his horse around. "See that you do," the sheriff replied, "and don't come back without a proper warrant." As Blackwood and his remaining men departed, Sheriff Taylor approached the porch. "Freeman," he acknowledged with a nod. "Mrs. Freeman." The use of Eleanor's married title was deliberate and not lost on anyone present. "Sheriff," Marcus replied, "what brings you out our way tonight?" "Let's just say a little bird told me Blackwood was organizing something foolish," Taylor said cryptically. "Thought I'd best check it out myself." Eleanor wondered if her father had somehow alerted the sheriff after leaving the ranch. It seemed the only explanation. "Well, we appreciate the visit," Marcus said, a hint of gratitude in his voice. Sheriff Taylor tipped his hat. "Just doing my job, making sure folks follow the law, all folks." He turned to leave, then paused. "By the way, Mrs. Freeman, your father asked me to tell you he's leaving town tomorrow, heading to his brother's place in Oregon. Said to tell you he was sorry." Eleanor nodded, too overwhelmed to speak. Her father's final act had been to help protect her. even as he fled the consequences of his own failures. After the sheriff and his deputies rode away, the ranch fell quiet again. The crisis had passed, at least for tonight. "You didn't have to do that," Marcus said softly to Eleanor as they returned inside. "Standing with me. They might have hurt you." Eleanor met his gaze steadily. "Yes, I did. Just as you didn't have to bid for me at that auction, but you did it anyway." She paused. "We protect what matters, don't we?" Something shifted in Marcus's expression. A softening, a recognition. He nodded slowly. "We do." That night, for the first time, Eleanor didn't lock her bedroom door, not because she expected or wanted Marcus to enter, but because she no longer feared him. Trust, like a tender seedling, had taken root between them. Sunday morning dawned clear and bright, the events of the previous night seeming almost dreamlike in the golden Colorado sunshine. Eleanor rose early, donning her best dress. The one she had worn to church every Sunday before her father's disgrace had made them unwelcome in the town's congregation. When she entered the kitchen, she found Marcus and Hattie already dressed in their Sunday best. "Do you attend church in town?" Eleanor asked, surprised. Hattie shook her head. "There's a small colored church about 10 miles east. The minister's a good man, fought in the Union Army alongside Marcus." "We should leave soon if we're to make the service," Marcus added, checking his pocket watch. Eleanor hesitated. Would it be appropriate for me to join you?" Marcus and Hattie exchanged glances. "You'd be welcome," Hattie said carefully, "but it might cause talk." "Everything about this situation causes talk," Eleanor replied with a small smile. "I'd like to come, if that's all right." The journey to the small church passed pleasantly, the three of them riding in Marcus's best wagon. As they approached the simple wooden building with its modest steeple, Eleanor felt a flutter of nervousness. How would these people receive her? Her concerns proved largely unfounded. While there were certainly curious glances and whispered conversations, the congregation welcomed her with cautious warmth. Reverend Johnson, a dignified man with kind eyes and a powerful speaking voice, made a point of greeting them personally before the service. "Mrs. Freeman," he said, taking her hand, "we are honored to have you join us today." The service itself moved Eleanor deeply. The singing was unlike anything she had experienced in the restrained white church of Thornridge, passionate, joyful, filled with genuine emotion. The sermon, focused on the story of Ruth following Naomi into a strange land, seemed particularly apt. After the service, during the community meal held on the church grounds, Eleanor found herself approached by an elderly woman who introduced herself as Mother Washington. "So you're Marcus Freeman's new wife," she said without preamble, her shrewd eyes evaluating Eleanor. "Been wondering when that boy would find someone, though I admit you're not what we expected." Eleanor wasn't sure how to respond, but Mother Washington continued without waiting. "Don't you worry about what anyone thinks, child. I was born a slave in Georgia, lived long enough to see wonders and horrors both. People will always find reasons to judge. Only thing that matters is what's in the heart." "Thank you," Eleanor said, genuinely touched by the woman's acceptance. "Just one question," Mother Washington added, leaning closer. "You love him?" The directness of the question caught Eleanor off guard. We, she stammered. Mother Washington chuckled. "That's what I thought. Give it time, child. Good soil eventually yields a harvest." As they prepared to leave, Reverend Johnson approached them again. "Brother Freeman, a word before you go?" Marcus nodded, stepping aside with the minister while Eleanor and Hattie waited by the wagon. "What do you think they're discussing?" Eleanor asked. Hattie's expression was troubled, probably warning him about Blackwood. Word travels fast out here, even between communities that don't often mix. When Marcus rejoined them, his face was serious but composed. "Ready to head home?" he asked, helping both women into the wagon. The ride back to Crescent Moon was quieter than the journey out, each of them lost in their own thoughts. As they crested the final hill and the ranch came into view, Eleanor gasped in horror. A plume of black smoke rose from the direction of the northern pasture. Marcus immediately urged the horses to a faster pace. When they reached the ranch yard, Samuel ran to meet them, his face grim. "Blackwood's men," he reported tersely, "set fire to the north fence line and stampeded a dozen head of cattle through. Isaiah and the others are trying to contain it now." Marcus jumped down from the wagon. "Get the water wagon and meet me there," he instructed, already heading for the barn to saddle his horse. "I'm coming too," Eleanor said firmly, gathering her skirts to dismount. Marcus paused, looking as if he might object, then nodded. "Change first. That dress isn't made for firefighting." For the next 4 hours, everyone at Crescent Moon Ranch worked tirelessly to contain the fire and round up the scattered cattle. Eleanor, dressed in a pair of Marcus's old trousers, hastily altered by Hattie, worked alongside the men, passing water buckets and helping to beat back flames with wet blankets. By late afternoon, the fire was extinguished, though a significant stretch of pasture was charred and unusable. Miraculously, they had lost only 2 cattle in the stampede. Eleanor sat exhausted on a rock, her face streaked with soot, watching as Marcus inspected the damaged fence line. Despite the destruction, she felt a strange sense of belonging. These people, Marcus, Hattie, the ranch hands, had accepted her as one of their own, and she had proven her commitment to their shared home. That evening, after everyone had bathed and eaten, Marcus asked Eleanor to join him on the front porch. The night was clear, stars scattered like diamond dust across the velvet sky. For a while, they sat in companionable silence on the porch swing. "You impressed everyone today," Marcus finally said. "Not many women, or men for that matter, would have worked so hard for a place they've known less than a week." Eleanor considered this. It felt right. "Like I was defending something that mattered," Marcus nodded. "Crescent Moon has that effect on people. First time I saw this land, I knew I'd die to protect it." He paused. "But land is just dirt without the right people to share it with." The implication hung in the air between them. Eleanor turned to study his profile in the moonlight. Strong, dignified, no longer a stranger, but not quite familiar either. "Marcus," she said softly, "what happens now? Between us, I mean." He met her gaze steadily. "That depends on what you want, Eleanor." "I want—" She hesitated, struggling to articulate feelings she was only beginning to understand. "I want to stay. Not because I have nowhere else to go, but because I want to be here, with you and Hattie, with this life we might build together." Marcus's expression remained guarded. "As what? My friend? My partner? My wife in name only?" "I don't know yet," Eleanor admitted honestly. "I know that sounds inadequate, but everything has happened so quickly. What I do know is that I respect you, I trust you, and I think there could be more between us given time." Marcus considered her words, then reached slowly for her hand. When she didn't pull away, he unfolded it in his larger one. "Time is something I can give," he said simply. They sat together as the moon climbed higher, hands intertwined, possibilities unfolding before them like the vast Colorado sky. The next morning, Eleanor woke to the sound of multiple horses and wagons approaching. Peering out her window, she was stunned to see what appeared to be half the town of Thornridge arriving at the ranch. Men, women, and children, many carrying tools and supplies. She dressed hurriedly and rushed downstairs to find Marcus already on the porch, looking as confused as she felt. Sheriff Taylor dismounted from his horse and approached. "Freeman," he greeted. "Mrs. Freeman." Behind him, the townspeople gathered, an uncertain murmur running through them. "Sheriff," Marcus replied cautiously. "What's all this?" Taylor cleared his throat. "News of yesterday's fire spread through town. These folks have come to help rebuild your fence line." Eleanor stepped forward, scanning the crowd in disbelief. She recognized the blacksmith, the cooper, several farmers and their families, even Pastor Williams from the town church. Conspicuously absent were Judge Whitaker, Mayor Hargrove, and Harold Blackwood. "Why?" Marcus asked, the single word containing volumes of justified suspicion. An older man stepped forward, Mr. Peterson, who owned the grain mill. "Because it wasn't right, what happened yesterday, or at that auction last week." He shifted uncomfortably. "Some of us stood by and did nothing when we should have spoken up. Can't change that now, but we can help fix what Blackwood's men destroyed." "And we brought lunch," called Mrs. Peterson, gesturing to the baskets and boxes in several wagons. "Enough for everyone." Marcus looked stunned. Eleanor took his hand, squeezing it gently in support. "We appreciate the help," she said, when Marcus remained silent. "There's a lot of work to be done." That broke the tension. The townspeople began unloading tools and supplies, organizing themselves into work parties. Sheriff Taylor approached Marcus more privately. "Thought you should know," he said quietly. "Blackwood's been arrested. Caught him and his men trying to set fire to the mill last night when Peterson refused to join another raid on your ranch. He's finished in Thornridge." As the unlikely work party spread out toward the north pasture, Eleanor saw another wagon approaching, this one carrying Reverend Johnson and several members of the colored church they had visited the day before. "Thought you might need some extra hands," the minister called as they arrived. For the first time since Eleanor had known him, Marcus Freeman looked completely overwhelmed. He stood silently as white and black neighbors, people who had likely never worked side by side before, began the task of rebuilding what hatred had destroyed. "This is what you did," Hattie said softly, appearing beside Eleanor on the porch. "With your courage that night when they came for you. You showed them they had a choice about what kind of community they wanted to be." The day passed in a blur of activity. The fence line was rebuilt stronger than before. The charred pasture was cleared and prepared for new growth. Food was shared, stories exchanged. Tentative friendships formed across boundaries that had seemed impenetrable only days before. As sunset approached, Pastor Williams and Reverend Johnson stood together and called for everyone's attention. "Before we part ways," Pastor Williams began awkwardly, "Reverend Johnson and I thought, that is, we wondered if Mr. and Mrs. Freeman might appreciate a proper blessing of their union, something more celebratory than the hasty ceremony at the auction." A murmur of approval ran through the gathered community. Eleanor looked at Marcus, a question in her eyes. He hesitated, then nodded, a smile finally breaking through his reserve. As the golden light of sunset bathed the ranch, Eleanor and Marcus stood before the two ministers. This time there were flowers, wildflowers gathered hastily from the fields. This time there was music, a fiddle played by one of the ranch hands, a hymn sung by Mother Washington. This time there were witnesses who came not out of legal obligation, but genuine goodwill. "Do you, Marcus Freeman, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife?" asked Reverend Johnson. Marcus looked into Eleanor's eyes. "I do," he said firmly. "And do you, Eleanor Walsh Freeman, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband?" continued Pastor Williams. Eleanor's heart swelled with an emotion she was just beginning to recognize. "I do," she replied. "Then by the authority vested in us," the ministers said together, "we pronounce you husband and wife." This time there was an invitation to kiss the bride. And this time, Marcus gently cupped Eleanor's face in his hands and placed a tender, respectful kiss on her lips, their first. The gathered community erupted in cheers and applause. As they turned to face their neighbors, Eleanor saw something remarkable in the faces looking back at them. Not tolerance, not acceptance, but something closer to admiration. That night, after the visitors had departed and the ranch was quiet once more, Eleanor and Marcus stood again on the porch, watching the stars emerge. "Your aunt said something interesting today," Eleanor remarked. "She said I showed them they had a choice about what kind of community they wanted to be. But really, you showed me first." Marcus looked at her questioningly. "When you bid for me at that auction," Eleanor explained, "you could have been like everyone else, seeing only what you were expected to see, doing only what was expected of you. Instead, you chose to see me as a person deserving of dignity and freedom." She took his hand, intertwining their fingers. "That night you asked me to wait before using my knife. You gave me a choice when no one else would. And every day since, you've given me the space to choose my own path." Marcus drew her closer. "And what path are you choosing now, Eleanor Freeman?" She smiled up at him, no longer afraid, no longer uncertain. "The one where we walked together." As they shared their second kiss beneath the star-filled Colorado sky, Eleanor knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them as they had faced everything else, with courage, with dignity, and with the strength that comes from choosing love over fear. If this story moved you, please hit the subscribe button and join the Black Rancher family. These untold stories of courage, dignity, and love deserve to be shared. Drop a comment below about what touched you most in Eleanor and Marcus's journey. Thank you for spending this time with us, exploring the hidden corners of American history where extraordinary people stood against injustice. Remember to share this video with someone who appreciates powerful stories of the human spirit. Until next time, may we all find the courage to choose what's right even when it's difficult.